Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for making it out here. I think the rain stopped from some people, and I think maybe Philly fatigue has stopped some people who are trying to rest up between all of these games. But I appreciate those of you who made it out here. First thing I just wanted to mention to everybody is that on December the 9th, I'm going to be doing what's called a CLE. It's called a Continuing Legal Education Program. But it's not only for lawyers, because really it's not going to be lawyer speak, if you know. It's really just a historical discussion of the Constitution. And I just feel like lawyers should probably know about the Constitution. So I would love for anybody to come. It's going to be a 4-hour discussion on December the 9th, where we're really going to go through the whole drafting of the Constitution. So I did a 4-hour discussion earlier where we lead up and we go through the antecedents of the Constitution and what leads to it. Then I do one about the drafting of the Constitution, and then after that we do one where we talk about the ratification procedure and the beginning of the the country under the Constitution. So $35 for 4 hour, and so the lawyer's got to pay $300. So this is a deal. So it's a bonus you get for not being a lawyer. So I was just thinking about the different talks we've had here today, kind of interweaving through Washington's life and going through different subjects of leadership and issues of leadership, and all of the changes that George Washington has made. And I guess it was back in January when we were starting off, and when we were talking about George Washington as a young man and what his dreams were, and really his dreams were that he was going to be a part of the British Army. And that was his greatest desire, was to join the British Army. Mount Vernon is of course named after a British admiral, and that's the way he saw his life going. And so we've gone through a lot of changes that he went through. He got sour about the British, and the British got sour about him, and a lot of things changed. As the general, he had a certain type of leadership which was very in your face, which was very follow me. And we heard a great lecture about Washington crossing the Delaware, and the moment of great problem occurring, and George Washington really over on that Battle of Princeton, when people were ready to go, saying, "Follow me," and leading the way and turning a defeat into a victory. And that's the kind of leader George Washington was. He was constantly pumping the United States position. He was gearing up the soldiers all the time. If you hear about that first Battle of Trenton, he's going back and forth and talking to all the soldiers the whole time. The great lesson of that is the only people who died stopped marching. They stopped marching and they froze to death. So just keep marching, and it's a better idea. But that was the kind of leader George Washington was. And then last month, we talked about a very different kind of George Washington. After the war had ended, after he resigned, he wasn't pushing things in terms of where the politicians should decide to go in terms of the country out in front of people. He was doing it behind the scenes. He was writing letters. He was publishing documents behind the scenes, a couple documents before he resigned. And then he really worked behind the scenes, writing to people, writing to James Madison, talking to people. But he didn't see it as his place to be leading the charge to creating a constitution, even though, once again, it turned out he was the indispensable person, because Madison might have all of the brains about it, Madison and Hamilton. There were a lot more intellectual people who were fighting for it, but it was going to be George Washington who had to show up there, and he had to be there in order to give it his stamp of approval, so that the majority of the country was going to feel comfortable with it. It's a wonderful book about the Constitution called The Framers' Coup, and it's a great title. because the author, whose name I can't remember right now, but he makes the point that probably 75% of the people did not want a constitution. And certain framers, such as Madison and Washington and Hamilton, set about to bring this about, because Washington's position was pretty clear. He had had to fight a war for 8 years without a government to back him up. And he knew that it was disastrous, that it was impossible, that it was beyond a headache. And he felt strongly that the country had to go in a different way. And if there's one big difference between George Washington and every other founder, it comes out really in this period of time that we're going to talk about. And that difference is George Washington is the only one of the founders who has pretty completely gone away from his local prejudices and defining himself locally. George Washington makes very clear when he resigns from the army, he says, you know, we didn't become independent state by state. Our independence rested on our combined efforts. The United States became independent. Virginia didn't, Connecticut, it couldn't have happened. And he's going to spend the rest of his life supporting this idea of a federal power and really being concerned about this possibility of a civil war that's going to happen many years later. A lot of his comments are going to show that how concerned he is about that, because he feels like if people stick with their local concerns rather than the federal concern, then the Civil War is inevitable. But he feels like if people define themselves as Americans, rather than I'm a Virginian or I'm from Connecticut, then it's all going to work out. And George Washington is going to spend this part of his life really putting this country together and trying to make that happen. When historians write about, when they take the polls about who's the greatest president, it's always Lincoln and Washington. And that's because Lincoln is going to, of course, save the nation and lead it to a new level, because once you have the 14th Amendment, the country becomes a very different place. And George Washington is the one who's going to really set it on its course. And so George Washington is president. Well, when we last spoke, he had just pushed people to go forward with the Constitution and helped to get it ratified. And once it did get ratified, then the question became, okay, is George Washington going to accept the presidency? There was never any question about whether he was going to win. It was really, it wasn't really an election, a campaign of people running against each other. Everybody knew it was going to be George Washington. Everybody said this during the convention. There was one moment where a delegate said, well, you know, we need to worry about this. We all know who the first president is going to be, but we don't know who the second president is going to be, and so on. And so it isn't a question. But George Washington is off in Mount Vernon, and he does not take part in the Virginia ratification process. Again, I believe because at this point he's presenting himself as the nation's leader, not the leader of a state. And once the Constitution is finally ratified, people start asking, is George Washington going to accept the office of the presidency? People are going to start writing him. Alexander Hamilton writes him in September of 1788, and he tells him, you need to accept this post. He says, the new government in its commencement may materially depend on your acceptance. He added that by serving the Constitutional Convention and supporting the document, he had in essence agreed to filling the station in question. In other words, you don't get to make this thing and then say, well, I don't want to do it. You know, you said this was a good idea. You said, you can't now just walk away. That's probably the kind of argument that works pretty well with Washington. Of course, Hamilton's desires are much like Washington's desires. Hamilton wants a strong federal government, and he now sees Washington as his means of getting there. Washington and Hamilton had had their issues back in the day. There was a big kind of spat between them when Hamilton got very angry at George Washington because Washington yelled at Hamilton for making him wait on the top of the stairs, and then Hamilton said, "Fine, I'll quit," and Washington said, "Fine." And then Washington somewhat apologized, and Hamilton wouldn't have anything to do with him. He resigned, and he wrote, "I haven't liked him for years. I've just been putting up with him. Do you think he's such a great person?" And I don't think so, in essence. But Hamilton now sees, all right, this is the guy who's going to make this a country. And that's everything that he wants. He wants a federal banking system. He wants a strong army. All of his dreams are connected to all of Washington's dreams. James Madison, who was Alexander Hamilton's partner in writing the Federalist Papers along with John Jay, he's going to do what he did before the Constitutional Convention, which is push him every opportunity he gets. You know, when Washington told Madison he would not take part in the Constitutional Convention, Madison said, all right, and then he wrote a letter to everyone and said, yeah, Washington's going to be there. Because he knew if Washington doesn't go there, it's not going to work, so I'm just going to say he's going to be there, and then I'm going to work to get him to come. And maybe he had the feeling that once it was legitimate, Washington would come. But he finally convinced him. So once again, he's going to start talking to him. Now, we don't have a lot of letters between them at the time because they used to visit somewhat regularly. And I think it's during those times where Madison's going to really press George Washington that you have to take this position. Gouverneur Morris says, you must be president. No other man can fill that office. No other man can awe the insolence of opposing factions. So Washington had never said that he would refuse the office, but he kept kind of not saying that he definitely would take the office. Now, what's concerning George Washington here? Well, first of all, George Washington's probably being completely honest when he talks about his desire to retire and his desire to be back and his fig tree and the farm and all of that stuff. But the other thing is, being president is very different from being general. George Washington felt pretty comfortable that he was as suited as anybody to be the general to lead the army. But George Washington doesn't see himself as a politician. And of course, all these other people in his orbit are, if you look at it from a intellectual who would score better on SAT kind of way of looking at it, you know, he's around Hamilton and Madison and Franklin. I mean, these people are geniuses. And so that would make anybody feel a little concerned about taking over, and you're supposed to be the president, and you've got all these brilliant people around here, and you've never been a politician. Of course, he has been a politician. Just like Eisenhower had to be a politician when he was a general, Washington had to be a politician when he was a general as well, but he doesn't really look at it that way. And so he's going to be somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of doing that. Now, you could say he was a politician because he was in the House of Burgesses. In the House of Burgesses, he never spoke. He sat in the back. And I think the one speech that he made was about people letting pigs out, and the pigs were making a mess on the streets, and they should, you know, have a rule that you can't let your pigs run around on the streets. So he was good for letting other people, Patrick Henry and others, do that. So when he talks about this, he says he hopes that integrity and firmness would be enough given his lacking of political skill. Is this going to be the thing that ruins his reputation? Always his concern. You know, when he first became general, Patrick Henry said he had tears in his eyes when he said, you mark this is the day that I will ruin my reputation by accepting this post. But he went forward with that, but is this going to work? Does he have the capability? I mean, think about taking this job. What is this job? Have you ever read the Constitution? There's no explanation as to what this job is. You make war Okay, what when there's no war? What do you do? Well, there's an advise and consent thing, which nobody knows what it means, and I don't know. You're the president. And so somehow you're going to have to form this into an actual position. You know, people talk about England and the unwritten constitution. And that sounds like a weird idea to us, but so much of our constitutional law and our practices are unwritten. There was no way to be too specific on that document. It wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to work out. So, George Washington's, with the help of others, is going to have to figure this all out. He's elected president. Charles Thompson, immediately when he gets the news, he goes rioting out to tell him. Now, Charles Thompson is a really intriguing character. He was the secretary at the Continental Congress. And he evidently wrote a book about everything that happened in the Continental Congress. And if we can kind of guess, it explains some of the pettiness and some of the arguments and some of the things that went on. So he wrote this whole book and then he burned it. And he said, people don't want to hear this. So we'll never know, you know, what is in this book, which is a real shame. But Charles Thompson is given notice to go out and inform George Washington. And he gets out there. So it's not like these days when you have a few months or whatever. Goes out, he tells George Washington, and George Washington returns with him. And he visits towns along the way. He visits Philadelphia, and everybody is constantly giving him these huge parties. Before he comes out, he visits James Madison, and he says to Madison, here's a copy of my Constitution. Sorry, my inauguration. And it's 78 pages. And Madison reads it and says, no, this will not do. And Washington says, well, what's wrong with it? He says, well, it's too long, it's too specific. And so Washington says, well, you write one for me. So Madison is going to do that. So his first inaugural is going to be mainly written by James Madison. Within it, he talks about his anxieties over being elected. And Washington is going to, once he becomes president, create a cabinet. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about a cabinet, but it wasn't unusual in England to have these kind of cabinets. He always had war councils as a general. So he's going to create this real all-star cabinet, and it's going to include Knox, the bookseller. Henry Knox was a bookseller who becomes the great general who gets those cannons out of Fort Ticonderoga, who was out here at Valley Forge, who, you know, it's another great thing about Washington that he's able to find people, whatever walk of life they come from. He had no military background back then. And he's going to be the Secretary of War. He's going to choose Alexander Hamilton to be Secretary of Treasury. He asks Robert Morris to do that. And Robert Morris doesn't want to do it. So Alexander Hamilton knows that George Washington's going to ask Morris. So Alexander Hamilton is sending Morris all of these interminable 30-page letters, which is the only kind of letter he really writes, on economic issues. And what he's doing is really trying to grease the wheels so that when he goes to Robert Morris, that Robert Morris will say, well, no, you should give this to Alexander Hamilton. And that's exactly what he does. And Washington says, well, Hamilton, what does he know about economics? And Morris said, believe me, he knows about economics, because he's gotten all these letters. So he's going to pick him for that. Picks Thomas Jefferson for Secretary of State. Now, the interesting thing is Thomas Jefferson isn't in the country. So he's happily in France, enjoying his life, having a good time. And then his daughter decides she wants to join a nunnery And so he says, well, you've had enough of France. I'm taking you back to America. So his idea is just to kind of show up, come back, drop the daughter off, bring some of his millions of toys that he's bought in France back, you know, and then go back to France. And then he's told, not only does Washington want to appoint you, he appointed you, and we voted on you, and you're already the Secretary of State. And Madison very concerned about making sure that Jefferson accepts this post. And Madison talks to him, and his position is, you know, it was a good idea for you to go to France. And basically Madison got him that gig out in France, in part because Jefferson was so torn up over the loss of his wife. And he was just back in Monticello, and he was very depressed. And Madison thought this would be a good thing for him, and it evidently was. But he says, you know, but you're an American statesman. You can't stay in France forever. You need to come back. You need to come back home, and the country needs you at this point. So Madison's going to talk to him about it, and Washington and Jefferson talk, and Jefferson basically says, well, I don't really want to do this, but, you know, I guess so if you want me to. Linda Chervinsky has written a great book called The Cabinet. I talked to her on my podcast, so if you're interested in hearing that or checking it out. And she talks in great deal about this, and it's one of these things we don't remember. We don't realize that there's nothing in the Constitution about a cabinet. Now, Washington loves to have, he loves to have advice. A lot of leaders don't want advice. Washington loves advice, and I think he loved having that cabinet. And he loved, even as it gets ugly, which we'll talk about, he still loves hearing these people and being able to hear the smartest people argue it out, and then him kind of trying to figure it out. So he really has no problem with that. But for those of you who have heard the Hamilton musical, there's that part where he says, you're going to be my right-hand man. So that did not happen. His right-hand man is James Madison. You know, James Madison is somebody who everybody figures he knows the most about the Constitution. He's going to be able to answer these questions. So, of course, he's already written the inaugural, and so he almost doesn't become a part of this because there were so many Virginians who were upset. Again, the founders' coup. So many Virginians upset about this Constitution that he lost the race for the Senate. Patrick Henry engineered opposition to him. It may have been the first case of gerrymandering. And then he does get elected to the Congress. So he's kind of, this first term, this huge, very important member of the Washington administration, but he's really not a member of the Washington administration. He's in the Congress. So, you know, he writes this inaugural address, and then when the Congress gets it, the House of Representatives, they say, well, we need to write a response, and so they tell Madison to write a response. So Madison's responding to the speech he made. Then Washington says, well, now you got to respond back to Congress. So he's writing to himself back and forth, and everyone's fine. Let Madison do these things, you know, he'll figure it all out. Washington's going to take these series of journeys through all of the states, and Philbrick writes about this. There's a new book by Philbrick, and it's kind of a travelogue. You know, whenever people travel with their dogs, I'm not the biggest fan of travel with dog books. I always figure, I remember William Least Heat Moon talked about the travels with Charlie and said it would have been a better book if he'd left the damn dog at home. But George Washington, Philbrick's going to go through all the places that George Washington went. And again, that's something most of us kind of skip over. You know, you hear that he visited the states. It was a really big job to do. It took months. It was no easy thing. And here he is in this carriage, and what he did is he said, I'm not going to go to people's houses, grand people's houses. I want to stay at inns. I want to just travel the way any other American would travel if they were going throughout the country. Kind of like if we can remember when Harry Truman drove all around the country after he left the White House. And there was a great moment where a police officer pulls him over for speeding. And then he sees Harry Truman with Bess Truman, and of course Truman demands, the guy says, I'm sorry. And then he's like, you give me a ticket, you know, you did the right thing, now don't you go away. So he makes him give him the ticket. I'm going to talk to you about the presidential libraries next month. But the Truman Library, they showed me down in the basement some of the other things that weren't up there, and one of the things I saw were all of the blankets and towels from the hotels he visited that he stole along the way that they have in the bottom of the thing. But Washington's going to make this trip to visit everybody. Now he asks John Adams to go with him for the northern states, and John Adams doesn't do that. Probably a big mistake on John Adams's part. People are trying to figure out what the heck is this vice president thing. He's president of the Senate, but he's in the executive. What is he supposed to be doing? And John Adams kind of saw it as, well, I'm the head of the Senate. And so he would speechify to the Senate, and the senators didn't want to hear it. And the first thing he wanted to do was, well, what are we going to call? He had some questions. Like one of his questions was, well, when Washington comes, I'm the president of the Senate, but Washington's the president, so what am I when he's in the room? People said, I don't know. He felt like the designation of president for Washington wasn't significant enough. There's all sorts of presidents. So he said, well, maybe we should make him His Excellency the President, His Highness the President. Well, the Senate's going crazy about this because, you know, it's very monarchical and they're very opposed to it. So they start calling John Adams His Rotundity the Vice President. Washington lets it be known President is fine with him. But anyway, Washington's going to take this trip. He's going to visit all of these places. He's not delighted with being president. He says, from the time I had done breakfast and thence till dinner and afterwards till bedtime, I could not get relieved from the ceremony of one visit before I had to attend to another. He has all these questions about decorum. How do I act? Of course, this is a new office, and a lot of people did not want a one-person head of the federal system. They thought it seemed too much like a king. So they basically went along with it because it was George Washington. But people have to ask themselves, well, how do I act? Washington would ask Madison, how should I act at, you know, we have a party once a week where people come over. How should I treat people? How should I act? All of these things were questions. Now, one thing he did just about every day was he would go out of his house, he would set his watch to the clock that's over at Independence Hall now, and he would walk around the whole city. And I think that was one of his way of showing what a president is, as opposed to a king, because you're never going to see King George walking down the streets of London by himself, but you could see George Washington doing that. Now there's other substantive questions. What does advise and consent mean? Am I supposed to work with the Congress? Am I supposed to be like a prime minister? Or do I just await their decision? Now, there was one point where Washington drafted instructions for a commission to negotiate a treaty with the Creek Indians. And so he figures, okay, I'm just going to go and I'm going to ask for advice and consent from the Congress, and they will say, you have our advice and consent, and move on. So he comes, and they ask John Adams to read it. Well, John Adams once was a great lawyer, once was a great orator, not so much anymore. He doesn't have any teeth, and so it's hard to understand what he says. So there's noise going on, there's noise out the windows, they really can't hear John Adams. And after he goes through the whole thing, Robert Morris asks him, well, we didn't really hear you, read it all again. And Washington's sitting here kind of feeling put upon that he has to sit here through all of this, and then he reads it again. And then members of the Congress say, well, leave this with us and let us we don't really understand this thing. Okay, give us a few days and we'll look at it and we'll decide. And Washington gets very angry. He says, this defeats the whole purpose of my coming here, and he marches out. So that was basically the last time a president went into Congress for that kind of thing. Other times presidents had to actually show up and negotiate with Congress was Lincoln had to when there was a investigation about his wife's purchasing things for the White House, spending too much money. And Lincoln had to go there by himself and kind of try to settle that one down. The other time was when Gerald Ford was called before the Congress after pardoning Richard Nixon. But pretty much after Washington marched out there, that was going to be the end of that. Now, it's not too far into his first term when George Washington gets very sick. He was diagnosed with anthrax, and it looks like he's going to die. They put straw out in front of his house, and everybody who goes to see him thinks he's at the end there. They decide they need to cut into him and take out this tumor that had spread. And once this doctor cuts into him, he finds that the tumor spread much more than he had thought. And the doctor was Samuel Bard, and he's there, he's with his father. And his father is John Bard, and the son is a little tentative, and John Bard says, "Cut away, deeper, deeper still, don't be afraid, see how he bears it." So Washington's awake, evidently, and surviving through this. Then he gets better, to a lot of people's surprise, and people feel like if he had died at that time, that might have had huge effects on our country and what happened with it then. Now we have Alexander Hamilton is putting together his economic system. And this is when we start to get the beginnings of parties. James Madison, who had been Hamilton's associate, friend, so forth, ally, is going to be opposed to this. And then in the middle of this is when Thomas Jefferson arrives. And Thomas Jefferson is going to, he doesn't really know Hamilton. And he comes out of his house one day and he sees Hamilton looking kind of messy, kind of schleppedicke, right? And he asks him what's wrong with him, and Hamilton says, "Your friend Madison, he's keeping the votes away from our economic system. If this vote doesn't go through, the whole country isn't going to make it." And so Jefferson says, "Well, let's meet like gentlemen and discuss this." And that's when you have this bargain that they sing about in the Hamilton musical, The Room Where It Happened, where Hamilton is going to get Madison to pull off his dogs and allow the bill to get through, and in return they're going to take the capital and they're going to move it to, of course, Washington, D.C. It's going to be in Philadelphia for 10 years. Of course, Madison and Jefferson hate the thought of the capital being in New York, where all the moneyed interests are. Now, the interesting thing about this, I've got this book here by David O. Stewart, wrote a very interesting book this year, and he talks a lot about the hidden hand of George Washington, how so often things work out exactly the way George Washington wants, and you don't see his fingerprints in it. And that's the interesting thing, is we know he met with Jefferson. He took Jefferson and Hamilton fishing, this famous moment where he said how famously the two got along and how great this was going to be. And he met with Madison. And so those people who went into the room got something and lost something. Hamilton, he got his bill passed, but the capital's going to leave New York City. Jefferson and Madison, well, the bill's going to have to pass, which they're not fans of, but they get the capital out of New York and they get it back near their home in Virginia. So everyone gets something and loses something except one guy, George Washington. Everything that worked out is the way he had wanted it. And it's going to help him out economically too, because he happens to own a lot of land that's in the new Washington, D.C. And George Washington is actually going to ride around and mark the lines of where Washington, D.C. is. So it's something that he writes, David O. Stewart writes about a lot. These things that work out exactly the way Washington wants them, but we don't really see his fingerprints. As time goes on, Hamilton and Jefferson become pretty bitter enemies. And the country starts to split along the lines. Now, one of the issues that happens is Philip Freneau gets, Philip Freneau was an old friend of James Madison's. He was a poet, and Madison knew him out in the University of New Jersey. And they convinced Freneau to come out to Philadelphia and to write an anti-Hamilton and really anti-Washington newspaper. Well, in order to make it all work, Jefferson gives him a job as a translator, even though he doesn't really, he's supposed to translate Spanish and he doesn't really know Spanish. You know, really, he's writing this newspaper. And Washington hates this newspaper. This newspaper, we all know that every president gets criticized, but this is the first president. And suddenly, for the first time in his life, he's really getting things written about him that are not very nice. And what really aggravates him is the guy keeps dropping off 3 copies every day at his house. And they keep saying, this man who wants to be the king of the world, and this aggravates George Washington, who says, I didn't even want to come here, I don't want to be king of anything, I want to be back in my house. And at cabinet meetings, when Knox brought one of these newspapers out, he starts yelling about it, and Jefferson mentions he had one of his kind of temper tantrums that he's so prone to, is the way that Jefferson put it. Washington's going to find himself really just trying to work to get these two to just be civil to each other. And he writes to Jefferson, and he says, how unfortunate and how much is it to be regretted that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing our vitals. My earnest wish and my fondest hope, therefore, is that instead of wounding suspicions and irritable charges, there may be liberal allowances, mutual forbearance, and temporizing yieldings on all sides. So both of them, he writes this to Jefferson and he writes it to Hamilton. Jefferson writes back that he had been duped by Hamilton into supporting funding and assumption, and that he had been made a tool for forwarding Hamilton's evil schemes. He said he didn't. Now, one thing that aggravates Jefferson and that he really has an argument about is the way Washington views the cabinet. These are guys to give him advice about whatever. And the way Jefferson sees it is, I'm Secretary of State. He's Secretary of Treasury. I should get my way when it becomes international matters, and, you know, I don't want him to get his way about the Treasury, but that makes a lot more sense to him. And that's not the way Washington views it. He'll put an issue out there for the cabinet, and everybody gets to have their say, which is how he always did things. It's how all of his war councils were. You know, his war councils always had far more people than other people's war councils. And he's listening to people. And that's why he wins that Battle of Princeton, because he has this war council with about 30 people in there, and one of them knows about this back road, and he gets this information, and he uses this back road, and he splits, the army is split, and he goes back, and he gets the people who are back in Princeton. So he likes the kind of give and take, and people chipping in with whatever. Well, Jefferson certainly doesn't appreciate it. Says, I've never interfered with Hamilton's department, but Hamilton had, by his cabals with members of the legislature, blocked his policies and subverted the country. Hamilton also would talk to diplomats from other countries and try to undercut Jefferson. So he had a legitimate gripe here. Jefferson writes, I will not let my retirement be ruined by the lies of a man who history, if history stoops to notice him, will remember as a person who worked to destroy liberty. So that doesn't sound like a letter that's real hopeful for bringing these two together. Hamilton writes, I know that I have been an object of total opposition from Mr. Jefferson. I know from the most authentic sources that I have been the frequent subject of most unkind whispers by him. I have watched a party form in the legislature with the single purpose of opposing me. I believe from all the evidence that passes that the National Gazette, which is the Freneau newspaper, was instituted by Jefferson for political purposes, true, with its main purpose to oppose me and my department, true. Nevertheless, I can truly say that besides explanations to confidential friends, I never directly or indirectly responded to these attacks. Not so true. But anyway, this is going to make things impossible for Washington to retire. George Washington had initially told Madison, well, I will stay for 2 years, and then I'll retire after 2 years, and Adams going to be president. Of course, that didn't happen. And now he is absolutely positive that he's going to retire. He tells everybody he's retiring. And you know, the ironic thing is that both Jefferson and Hamilton, the one thing they agree on is that Washington cannot retire. Washington is the only thing keeping things going along. And if he leaves, the whole thing falls apart. And Washington is not going to listen to these arguments from people, but it's Eliza Powell who really convinces him by saying, if you resign after just one term, they're going to say that position's too hard for any man. They're going to say George Washington couldn't do this. And they're going to say that you resigned in order just to protect your reputation. So he kind of says, fine, I'll do another term. He's not happy about it. And go check out the second inaugural address by George Washington one time. Look it up on the internet. It's the shortest inaugural in American history and the grumpiest inaugural. He's not happy about it, and he basically says, I'll do my best. If I don't do well, you know, you can always impeach me. And that's it. So he comes back, and then we have the Revolution of France. The French Revolution is going to throw everything in a tumult because you have some Americans, and it just kind of, it goes into the whole fight that's already happening. You've got people like Hamilton who love the British Constitution and who want us to be allies with England. And then you have people like Jefferson and Madison who want us to be allies with France. So when this breaks into a revolution, it's going to tear up the country. It's going to create these opposing forces. And this is going to create a situation where you have mobs outside George Washington's house. John Adams orders this big case of rifles so that they can defend their house when the mob comes in and starts to attack them, because it seems very possible. And they're going to argue about this, of course, in the cabinet. You know, Jefferson's position is, France helped us. We never would have become a country without France. So how on earth do we turn away from France now? And of course, Hamilton's position is, well, that's not the government that helped us. The government that helped us has been overthrown. And you know, King Louis isn't even alive anymore. So in the Hamilton musical, they describe this discussion this way. They have Hamilton saying, we signed a treaty with a king whose head is now in a basket. Would you like to take it out and ask it? Should we honor our treaty? King Louis's head? Do whatever you want. I'm super dead. That's kind of what they did argue. He's dead. We didn't agree to anything with these people. Washington is going to come up with his neutrality proclamation, one of his biggest moments as the president. You know, what Washington's trying to do is get through a few years, not get in a war, and the way he sees it, America is in this great moment. There's nobody out west. There's nobody challenging us. And if we can just keep away from all these European wars, we could start to build our country. So that's what he's going to work towards doing. In the meantime, you have Citizen Genet come out here. Citizen Genet is this Frenchman who immediately creates havoc and really hurts Jefferson's cause by claiming that you know, Washington has no power, that he can get the people, if they agree with Genet, they can overthrow Washington, and he really, at first Jefferson's delighted to have him out there, and Genet becomes such a mess that Jefferson won't have anything to do with him. Eventually, they write to France and say, you got to take this guy back, and France agrees to take him back. Well, Genet goes and asks Washington, says, you've got to let me stay in America. You know, they're going to cut my head off if I go back there. And so he does, and Genet actually stays in America the rest of his life. Now, one of the things that Washington starts speaking out against are the so-called democratic societies. Jefferson and Madison, they're pushing forward these democratic societies. To them, this is something that democracy is going to create. But to Hamilton, and increasingly to Washington, these are cabals of people opposed to the government who are connected to a foreign country. So as Washington starts talking about the danger of the democratic societies, Jefferson starts really working against Washington and talking about Washington. You know, Jefferson has the greatest admiration for Washington in the war, says that this one man alone stopped us from the war turning into the same kind of tyranny that every other revolution has turned into. But he's been very disappointed by the way he was as president. He's very disappointed by sort of the pomp of what he presumes is the pomp of royalty that's going on. You know, he's going to, when Jefferson's president and the British minister is brought over to the president's house to meet him, Jefferson comes down in a bathrobe and slippers, which I'm sure Jefferson did very purposefully. He loved annoying the British. And he sees things as just getting out of control and being too pompous and turning into something that's just too much like England. Washington's going to send John Jay out. John Jay is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he's going to send him out to negotiate a treaty with England. He does so, but it seems like England gave like nothing up, and that America is just being abject and cowering to England. So the anti-England forces, this is what really creates the mobs. And here's George Washington. There's parts of the treaty he doesn't like. But of course, this is not the kind of situation where you can keep going back and forth and changing it. I mean, this is the treaty that Jay wrote, and he either has to accept the treaty or refuse it. So he is going to accept the treaty. And that's when you have these mobs. John Jay is going to say, I can go from one end of the country to the other, lit the whole way by my burning effigies. So that's how it worked out for him. You're then going to get just absolutely rampant party division. You know, Washington had been concerned if he would be risking his reputation if he got lured back into public life, and he was right. Massachusetts Minister Nathaniel Ames expressed popular sentiment when he wrote, better his hand had been cut off than his return. He has blasted all of his laurels. John Laurel writes to Madison that the public, which had formerly rejected attacks on Washington, now received them with avidity. Washington, he wrote, had marked himself indelibly as the head of a British faction, and gratitude no longer blinds the public mind. It was now written that he had only been appointed general because he was so pallid a character that he aroused no antagonisms, and that it had been chosen president because of the insipid uniformity of his mind. So things have turned the way they often do with presidents in their second term. The other thing that aggravates George Washington is that, you know, Jefferson and Hamilton went to him and begged him to stay, said, we can't go on without you. And he did, and then they both resigned. And he felt like, well, you know, now I'm the only one here. And the people, which again happens with pretty much every administration, all the stars that were in that cabinet, suddenly the cabinet becomes a pretty meaningless affair to him. So George Washington, of course, is going to decide to, well, he's always determined to resign after his second term. And so, of course, we have Congress Hall right nearby in Philadelphia, this place where you have this magnificent moment where the first time ever in a large country, you have one leader, democratically elected leader, turning his power over to another one. And so it's just this stunning moment that happened out there in Congress Hall. George Washington standing behind John Adams being sworn in. And Adams writes to Abigail about it, and he says, everybody in the room was crying. They're either very sorry to see him leave or very sorry to see me come. He also says, the only person not crying was George Washington. And that was obviously true. He seemed suspiciously cheerful. Washington is delighted to be done with the presidency. And when they all get up to leave, everyone just stands and waits for George Washington to walk through first. And he says, nope, you know, I'm a citizen now. So he makes Jefferson goes first, Adams goes second, and then he goes out with the rest of them. And then he is going to finally get his opportunity to go back to his vine and his fig tree in Mount Vernon. He's going to die about 3 years later when he goes out in the cold and he catches some kind of a cold. And before the doctor comes, he has an aide just bleed him and bleed him and bleed him. And Martha is very concerned about this and says, well, maybe shouldn't we wait for the doctor? And he says, no, no, keep bleeding me. And it's kind of the way his father died. It's kind of the way he expected to die. But there's some good writings about how exactly it happened. And then he's going to write, well, not going to write, but then we're going to get his will, which does free all of the slaves he's able to free. And I think, again, this goes back to what his concern was at that time, which is slavery and what slavery is going to do to the country and the possibility of the Civil War. So I think he's trying to show a way out of this. And it's an interesting document if you ever have a chance to look at it, because, you know, we don't realize the complications of freeing slaves in that time, especially in this circumstance, because there were Custis slaves and there were Washington slaves. So he can't free the Custis slaves legally. They revert to the Custis family. Some of them are intermarried. Some of them are older and don't want to leave. Some of them are younger and need education. So he finds places and educational opportunities, and he offers some people the opportunity to leave or to stay. But I think it's I think it was his last statement, really, to the American people, was what he put in that will. And so there you have it. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have.